We, of course, had gone to Africa in large measure, I think, to view wildlife and so on. And we had some wonderful opportunities. Chad had a good deal of wildlife, and then the Waza in Cameroon we visited as well, and had some marvelous experiences there. But as we traveled around, it was interesting. We'd gone up to Ati, and which is right at the base of the desert in the northern Sahel, and then traveled southward to the Mango Massif, and there we were encamped with basically a troop of baboons that were in the rocks, and we were also sort of entertained by local singers and so on spontaneously, and with them expecting no compensation or anything. They simply performed and left. And it was interesting. We continued further south, and we hit the Bar Salamat, a river, and so we tried to seal the engine of the Land Rover so that it wouldn't take in water, and crossed, and then in process of crossing, drifted off a sandbar, and so we were found ourselves in the middle of this large river, and a Libyan truck driver came by and understood the situation, and he pulled us out of the river, and we spent the next day or so drying out and so on. But again, one of these sort of examples of generosity and concern and so on that we found throughout the trip. Traveled south, and we went to what was then Fort Archambault. It's now the city of Sar, and we were again interested in wildlife. And we met these two remarkable white hunters that resided in the city, Claude Vasselet and Mickey Micheletti, and it was interesting. They had set up they call it the bush telegrams, networks of informants, and they could tell us where a lion was at any particular time, if it was yawning on its back, if it was, I mean, these guys had so much information. And I had noticed, Dee and I and Will and Gina would drive around occasionally at night. We had a spotlight, and see this, it looked like a small striped hyena, but it obviously wasn't. It was an aardwolf, and it would look at our books of wildlife and so on. Aardwolves weren't supposed to be north of the Orange River in South Africa, and I mentioned this to Claude, and he said, "Oh yeah, there are aardwolves out there." I mean, they knew so much more about what was out there. And so we had this wonderful experience with them, and it seems almost as though this travel is a kind of a strange kind of a way of drinking beer and because we'd always be hosted by these people, and so Johnny Walker stepped in and was a part of this as well. We then went to the south of Fort Archambault, and there was a Jesuit mission, and the Jesuit priest.
I'll tell you what, let me get another story as a prelude to that here, if I may.
Oh,
so
yes, please do.
Back to the hunting guides. One of the things they did for us was, we'd been traveling around looking for all this wildlife, but one of the things we had not seen, I don't know either at all, I think maybe, or not much of, was elephants. And we wanted to get some pictures of elephants. So one of the things they suggested was they knew a good watering hole that not every night, but a lot of nights the elephants would show up. So they suggested we go there at night, get up in a tree, and be prepared with our cameras to take pictures. Well, as a prelude to that, as we'd driven around, we knew there were elephants in the area. We just hadn't seen them. But the way we knew elephants were in the area is that they had reached up and torn off branches and to eat the branches and leaves and stuff like that. So the prelude piece of information here. So we go to this watering hole toward evening. Each of us get up and find a separate tree to get up into, and sitting there waiting for it to get dark, and kept waiting for elephants. So I'm sitting up there. It's now dark, and we're waiting for elephants. Hadn't come yet. And I started thinking, wait a minute, is this a good idea? I'm sitting in a branch of a tree. How did I know that elephants were around earlier? Because they reached up, grabbed a branch, tore it off, and ate on it. Now, what if they decide to grab the particular branch I'm sitting on here? I'm not sure I want to be here taking pictures of elephants that badly. So we kind of backed off on that a little bit, but it was one of my moments where, is this the right way to do this? Had to rethink that a little bit. But then, maybe this is another good place as a prelude to the priest who changed his ideas about the safe.
Yeah.
One of the things that traveling through Chad was so fascinating about is the change in Africa in general is coming from the coast in. And so Chad, being right in the middle of the continent of Africa, is one of the least changed parts of all of Africa. There's a lot of pre-industrial societies still at that time, at least in the mid-60s. So we were spending a lot of time looking at these and traveling around them and having experiences with them. And one day it finally dawned on me to ask the question. So here you have it, a pre-industrial society and industrial societies like we'd grown up with in the United States. What's the fundamental difference? How is it that we got on this track to where we are and they're on a different track? And after I thought about it for a while, what I finally concluded, I don't know if the others would agree with that or not, but for me, it boiled down to two pieces of technology: electricity and the internal combustion engine. We had those. And all the stuff that makes us so industrial are downstream developments of the internal combustion engine, cars and engines for factories, and electricity, all the lights and communication stuff that we now have. You take those, but the other part of that is you take those two things out of our society, and tomorrow morning we would be just like the pre-industrial societies. Everything downstream away from it. Without that, we're there, and with it, we're over here. But that maybe is a prelude to this encounter, because this priest also had some thoughts about pre-industrial societies and industrial societies that turned out to be interesting.
Just to sort of tag on to what Dee had said with regard to pre-industrial or indigenous and in the westernized components of society, what we don't normally understand is the adaptations of sort of indigenous societies is really scientific. It's cause and effect and trial and error and so on. And relatively low levels of technology and of high levels of sustainability. And so what the colonial period did was basically cripple these societies and substitute modern agriculture and so on. And so people are both disoriented and poisoned by these chemicals and so on. And so it's an interesting thing and something that I dealt with quite a bit later with the National Academy of Sciences. But what was interesting with regard to the mission was David Knight was the name of the Jesuit used for Fort Worth, Texas. And he had a mission, and it had a corrugated metal roof, and and so there would be a convectional cell coming off of the roof, and birds would fly across the mission, and the temperature gradient changed, the rapid change, many of the birds would have coronaries and die. And so you had birds coming across and just crashing. And so the local population said, well, Christianity, it's a nice idea, and we like David, but I don't think that Christianity is quite where we want to go with this. And Islam was migrating southward, and the Jesuits already had determined that Islam was gaining favor with the local populations. So David became basically an agricultural consultant, and
paid less attention to his evangelism and more to agriculture. Yeah.
Right, and it was interesting. I think that he began to question it. He went back to Fort Worth and married, actually. So he had his own questions, I think. But it all goes having to do with birds having coronary. But that was interesting, and it was interesting being in contact with the Jesuits as well, because they really had an incredible amount of information regarding the politics of the region and so on. But there was this sort of a subdued side of it, of their feeling that they were really a part of the French establishment, mm-hmm. and that this was eroding very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Well, the end of our time in Chad, as we began to get ready to leave the country, had a very dramatic moment to it that I think is worth sharing. We'd come into Chad and had to apply for visas to the other countries ahead of us that we planned to go to, like Central African Republic and Southern Sudan and Congo, Uganda, and over to the game preserve. And that's where we had to send our visas and so forth off to the Paris to get we had to send our passports off to Paris to get the visa and come back. So that's what gave us 4 weeks to spend in Chad while we were waiting on those. So that's where we'd spend a lot of time going around the country. But finally the time came, the end of that, our passports came back with the visas, everything was in order. At long last, we were finally ready to move on to the next chapter of our trip. So we were excited about that. We went out to camp our last night in Chad, just outside of the capital city of what was then called N'Djamena. And next morning, so we packed up everything, got our sleeping bags and everything put in, and went back into the embassy, though, just for a moment to check our mail. This was one of the periodic mail stops we have, where we had people send mail from the U.S. if they wanted to get to us. And so we went in to see if we had any mail, but just per chance, while we were there, we ran into one of the people we had gotten to know over this time, the vice counselor, I guess, there. And so he knew us and knew what was going on with us, and he saw us and he said, well, it looks like you guys are getting ready to leave. He said, is that true? I said, well, yeah, we finally got all our visas and everything, so we packed up camp and getting ready to head out. He says, well, where are you headed next? I said, well, we're going to go south to Central African Republic and then work our way over to East Africa. So I said, going down to Central African Republic. I said, yeah, that's where we're headed. He said, well, I'd like to ask you to not go there today. He said, I'm not at liberty to tell you why today, but if I really would strongly ask that you stay one more night and come back tomorrow, and I can tell you then what I can't tell you today. Well, we were really disheartened because we've been waiting 4 weeks for this moment, but we knew this person well enough that if he said that, there was something going on. So we said, well, if that's what you recommend, okay. So we went out, camped out one more night, came back the next day. And what he told us then that he couldn't tell us the day before is that the American government were sending paratroopers into the western part of the Central African Republic to evacuate Western whites, because for some reason, we had no idea why, and I just still don't know. Something had irritated the people there, and they were really angry at Westerners in that way. And we would have driven right through that area with, of course, with no guns and no resistance, and without any knowledge that something dangerous was going on there. So an extraordinary piece of good fortune. So we appreciated that, but realized that meant we could not go south and follow that itinerary to get to East Africa. So what we decided, we once again had to change our plans, and so instead of going south, let's go east and see if we can maybe go into South Sudan or go through Ethiopia or someplace like that. So we changed our itinerary, but that was the one really close encounter we had with a serious, dangerous situation at the end of that time in Chad. Well, once we had learned that we shouldn't go down to the Central African Republic at all, then we went, had to reroute our trip here. So what we decided we needed to do was to go from where we were right at that point, Fort Archambault in Chad, and head east to Khartoum and see if we could find some way to go south from Khartoum, either through southern Sudan or through Ethiopia. But when we went east from Fort Archambault, we again encountered a road that, shall we say, presented some challenges. I'm going to let Jeff tell you about the first challenges we encountered, which was in the eastern part of Chad on that trip.
Yeah, is coming across into Sudan through Ate and Al Bishay and El Fasher and into Sudan.
This all on the southern edge of the Sahara, so that's prelude to this story.
Yeah. And the Land Rover had periodic problems of one kind or another. We heard the screeching, and it was the right front bearings had gone out. And so we stopped in this little village, Ati, and there was this remarkable. He was a Hausa from Nigeria, spoke English. He had worked with the British Armed Forces during the Second World War, and asked what the problem was, and it was pretty obvious. And he said, "Okay, I think I can take care of this." And in Africa, very often you have these kind of graveyards of old tractors and vehicles and all this stuff that had been either put in place by the war or by donor organizations. And so he went back and he fussed around and he found a race for the bearings, and he put grease on it, and he went out and he sorted and got bearings and he put them in and slapped it back on the Land Rover, and it's still on the Land Rover to my knowledge, someplace in Colorado. But it was so remarkable how to me how good these people were at solving problems, and he required no compensation. Something he was happy to do it and send us on the way.